There are certain stories you don't bring up at family gatherings, not because they're embarrassing or painful, but because they just don't feel right to talk about. This is one of them. I was 8 the last time I visited my grandparents' house. I never went back after that. My grandparents lived in a quiet town, the kind where time felt slower. They had been there for as long as I could remember, in a modest house at the edge of a long dirt road. My dad dropped me off one afternoon, stayed for lunch, then left. After that, I spent most of the afternoon outside, playing with a stray cat that had been hanging around their yard. My grandfather sat on the porch, watching me in silence, while my grandmother stayed inside, probably cleaning or baking like she always did. At some point, she called me in for dinner. I don't remember exactly what we ate, but it was something homemade, probably soup or stew, something warm. We talked a little, nothing serious. Just the usual questions. How was school? Was I making friends? Was I listening to my parents? After dinner, we sat in the living room while they watched TV. I wasn't paying much attention to the show, just flipping through an old deck of cards on the coffee table, passing the time. It was a normal day. When it became late, my grandmother told me it was time to sleep. I wasn't really tired, but I didn't argue. I went to the extra room where I always stayed. Then I climbed into bed. Everything felt normal. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep. The wind was strong outside, making the curtains flutter. It was hot, so I preferred leaving the window opened. Then I heard something else, a faint scraping sound. At first it blended into the wind, but then it came again. I sat up slightly, listening. The sound moved from one side of the roof to the other. I wanted to believe it was just the wind pushing something across the shingles, but the pauses felt deliberate. Then, out of nowhere, a sudden sharp knock. I froze. I heard my grandparents moving. A door swung open. My grandfather's boots hit the floor. My grandmother whispered something I couldn't understand. Then, footsteps coming toward my room. The door opened, and my grandmother rushed in first, her face pale. My grandfather followed with a riffle in his hands. "Under the bed," she whispered. I obeyed without question, sliding off the mattress and pressing myself against the wooden floor. From my hiding place, I saw my grandfather move to the window. He lifted the curtain an inch, staring out. His body was rigid, unmoving. Then, from above, another faint scraping sound. My grandmother clutched the rosary around her neck, whispering under her breath. We stayed like that for around half an hour, waiting, listening. Eventually, my grandfather exhaled, lowering the rifle. Without saying anything, my grandmother reached down and touched my shoulder. "Come," she whispered. They took me to their room. I slept between them that night. None of us spoke. None of us slept much either. I thought maybe they wouldn't mention it in the morning, but when I came into the kitchen, they were already sitting at the table, staring at their coffee. My grandmother had a Bible open in front of her, but she wasn't reading it. My grandfather stared out the window, his fingers tapping against the table, slow and restless. I sat down, waiting for them to say something. My grandfather exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "They haven't come in a long time." I hesitated. "Who?" My grandmother's eyes flickered to the window before she answered. "The witches." She barely whispered it, like the word itself could bring them back. She looked at me then, her face tight. "They know when there are children in the house." A chill ran through me. Before I could say anything else, I heard a car pull up outside. I frowned. My dad wasn't supposed to come until the end of the week. I looked at my grandparents, but neither of them seemed surprised. My grandfather stood up and grabbed my bag. My grandmother placed her hand on my shoulder. No one said it, but I understood. My parents didn't ask many questions. Maybe they expected my grandparents to be their usual selves, smiling, talking about how much fun I was having. Instead, they were quiet. My grandfather barely spoke as he carried my bag to the car. My grandmother hugged me tight, her grip lingering longer than usual. Before we left, she looked at my dad. "Let's not bring him here again." My dad nodded. I didn't argue. That night, back home in my own bed, I lay awake for a long time listening. I thought about the noises, the scraping, the pauses between movements, the way it had stopped, right before the laugh. But eventually, sleep came, and over time I started to forget, not all at once, but little by little the memory faded, like a bad dream. But I never went back.
I've been a nanny for a few years now, and if you think it's just babysitting, you'd be surprised. A good nanny doesn't just watch kids. We anticipate their moods, handle tantrums, prep meals, and keep the house running smoothly. Sometimes we become a child's entire world when their parents are too busy. It's exhausting, sure, but rewarding. My days start early, usually around 7 a.m. I prepare breakfast, balancing something nutritious with something they'd actually eat. Kids can be picky, and getting a 4-year-old to eat fruit instead of just cereal is a battle of psychology. Then comes the morning routine: brushing teeth, picking out outfits, and getting them ready for the day. Once the kid is at preschool, I have a few hours for light housework or personal time before picking them up. Afternoons are filled with playtime, lunch, and quiet activities. Some days I take them to the park or arranged play dates. Once dinner and the bedtime routine are finished by 8 p.m., my workday is usually done. The schedule is demanding but manageable, with structured breaks when the kids are at school or napping. I loved it, even on the hard days. But I'd left my last job under tense circumstances. The child I cared for, Max, had become incredibly attached to me, more than his own parents, and that was a problem. His mother resented how much he clung to me, and no matter how much I tried to redirect his affections, she saw me as a threat. It escalated until one day she told me I was no longer needed. It broke my heart, but I knew I had to move on. That's why I was excited when I landed a live-in position for a single mom and her 5-year-old daughter, Sophie. The pay was great, the hours were stable, and the house was a dream. One of those modern homes with high ceilings and too many doors. Most importantly, Claire, the mother, seemed easygoing and genuinely kind. She wasn't just hiring help, she wanted someone who could bond with Sophie. The first day was great. Sophie was sweet, Claire was welcoming, and everything felt comfortable. Claire seemed relaxed, chatting with me casually about the job, and for the most part, everything felt natural. But when she brought up one particular rule, something in her tone shifted. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Don't open the door at the end of the hall," she said, her voice still light but lacking the same ease as before. "It just stays shut, okay?" Every house has its quirks. Maybe it was just a storage room, or maybe she didn't want Sophie playing in there. It seemed like a harmless enough request. I was too grateful for the job to question it or invade her privacy. Life with Sophie was enjoyable. She was energetic, talkative, and eager to do things herself. Mornings were spent getting her ready for preschool, and afternoons were a mix of activities. She was curious and always on the move, helping with small tasks. Mealtimes could be a challenge, and bedtime often involved negotiating for one more story, but eventually she'd settle in. Overall, the job was predictable and pleasant. Sophie was an easy kid, bright, chatty, and at that age where they tell you the wildest things with full confidence. One night, everything started changing. As I tucked Sophie in, she looked at me seriously and whispered, "Can I tell you a secret?" I nodded, expecting something innocent. But then she leaned in closer and said, "There's a girl in there." She doesn't like being alone. She pointed toward the hallway. I paused, smoothing her blanket. To who, sweetie? The girl in the locked room. I forced a smile. You mean your mommy? Sophie shook her head. No, the other girl. A shiver crawled down my spine. It's funny how one small thing can change everything. From that night on, I became aware of the door in a way I hadn't before. I started noticing how Sophie never played near it, how she kept a careful distance when she passed it in the hallway. A few days later, as I was tying her shoes, she mumbled, "She doesn't like when the door is locked." I kept my voice light. Who doesn't like it? She frowned like I was being dense. The girl locked in the room, she gets lonely. The hair on my arms prickled. I laughed it off, but something about the way Sophie said it, so matter-of-fact, stayed with me. I told myself it was just a child's imagination. But as the days went on, Sophie kept mentioning the girl. Once, as I tucked her in, she whispered, "She's watching." I didn't turn around. I didn't want to. Another night she reached for my hand and said, "She wants you to say goodnight to her." I stared at the closed door down the hall. My chest felt tight. I forced a chuckle. "Well, good night." Sophie beamed and snuggled into her blankets. Now she's happy. My blood ran cold. We were completely alone. By week 3, I was jumpy. I found myself avoiding looking at the door entirely. The worst part? Nothing happening. There were no creaks, no flickering lights, no eerie shadows. Just an ordinary door that suddenly felt impossibly, terrifyingly. Then one night I was closing Sophie's door when I heard her whisper, "She's in there right now." I gripped the doorknob. My voice was barely steady. "Sophie, who is she?" She blinked at me like I was the child. The girl in the locked room. Mommy locked her. I nearly quit that night. The next morning, I moved through my routine like a ghost, fixing Sophie's breakfast, dropping her off at preschool, tidying the house. But my mind was elsewhere. The locked door. By midday, my curiosity got the better of me. Claire wasn't home, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I walked slowly down the hallway, stopping in front of the door. I placed my hand on the knob, hesitated, and twisted. Locked. I kneeled down and peered through the small gap beneath the door. Darkness. Something about that emptiness sent a wave of unease through me. I reached up again, hand gripping the knob, this time willing myself to turn harder. But I stopped. I didn't want to know. I pulled my hand away, stood up, and walked back down the hall, telling myself it didn't matter. That night, before going to bed, I stood in front of the door, arms crossed, trying to rationalize everything. It was just a door, just a locked room, nothing more. I told myself Sophie had an active imagination, that I had let my own fears get the best of me. I even whispered a quiet goodbye to the ridiculous fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks before finally heading to bed. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, heart hammering. It rattled again, harder this time, as if something was testing it from the other side. I ran. I didn't stop to think. I didn't check to see if anything was behind me. I went to my room, grabbed my things, and left. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally took control, and I let it. I needed to be anywhere but there. I packed my things and left. The next morning I called Claire, keeping my voice steady as I explained I had a family emergency and wouldn't be able to come back. She didn't ask questions. She just sighed and said she understood. I never found out what was behind that door, and I never wanted to know.
If you're still here, you've been marked. The only way to stay safe? Stick with us. Subscribe before it's too late. And if you have a horror story of your own, something real, something you can't explain, tell us in the comments or send us an email. We're always watching,